Welcome to Designing the Future. This series is a space for dialogue, reflection, and imagination, where Indigenous voices lead the way in rethinking the systems that shape our lives. From education and healthcare to governance, economies, and beyond, we'll explore how Indigenous knowledge, lived experience, and cultural wisdom can guide us towards a more inclusive and equitable tomorrow. The conversations you'll hear are grounded in story and spirit. They are not just ideas, but lived realities that carry both resilience and responsibility. Some of what we share may be sensitive, as it touches on histories of harm, systemic inequities, and ongoing struggles faced by Indigenous peoples. We encourage you to listen with openness and care, and to remember that healing and transformation come through truth, respect, and relationship. This is not simply a podcast or a video series. It's an invitation to imagine new possibilities, to engage critically, and to act collectively. Together, let's design a future that honors Indigenous knowledge and creates space for equity, dignity, and respect for all. I'm your host, Laura Mueller, and this is Designing the Future. Thank you for joining us today. This is our last episode of Designing the Future, and today we're going to be talking about land and more than human perspectives. And we have Danny with us, and I will let Danny introduce themselves to the viewers.
Yeah. So, hi, I'm Danny McNeil. I'm a Red River Métis citizen. My family names are Nolt, Perot, Carrier, Duchemin, a couple of other ones. There's lots of Métis names in my family's lineage. We're from the St. Boniface, St. Norbert, St. Vital, and St. Pierre-Jolie area, which is now mostly all of colonial Winnipeg. Yeah.
All right. So land, the reason I want to talk about land in more than human perspectives is because I think it is often the most understood aspect of indigeneity. And, you know, you hear about all of these initiatives like Land Back and, but what is it? Like, and even for myself, you know, before I started going to school, even as an Indigenous person, I didn't quite understand the concept and why it's so important to Indigenous people. I know you have through school you have a background with land, and you're really looking at Indigenous concepts of land, and so yeah, I mean that's
it's a very broad question, and I could go many. This conversation could go many ways,
yes,
and this is a topic that's very obviously special to me.
Yep.
And please cut me off if I start to rant for way too long.
That's why we're here.
Yeah, so I guess, okay, so if I can repeat the question, you're curious as to how land and indigeneity kind of interact with one another in sort of this more kind of like robust picture.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think it's important to keep in mind that Indigenous people are a place-based people. And that's just like across the board for all Indigenous folks. Like there is Indigenous language, Indigenous stories, Indigenous culture is all very much foundation in the land. Like everything that comes out of Indigenous cultures and ways of being is fundamentally rooted in the concept of land as kin, as a person, as a spirit. Like it's not Indigenous people don't see land as a commodity or as something that you can take commercial value from, which is a very kind of common Western understanding of land as property and as resource extraction, obviously, as a way to kind of make obviously money, but also power. There's a lot of power tied up in the privatization of land and wealth that's tied up in privatization of land. And that is a very fundamentally different understanding of land to Indigenous people, where land for Indigenous people, again, like I said, land is a family member. It's a place where everything that comes out of an Indigenous worldview is rooted in land. And that makes sense when you think about it, because human beings are just as much a part of nature as anything else. And we're part of this ecological web, and I think colonization in particular has really sort of driven a wedge between our understanding as humans, as active participants and part of nature, versus people that are here to just kind of lord over the resources of the land and take them as we will and do what we want with them in order to progress whatever human ambitions we have, without thinking about kind of that broader impact. And yeah, I like, it's so hard to say, because I feel like it can be summed up by saying, like, Indigenous people are from the land, by the land, and everything that is wrapped up in an Indigenous worldview comes back to this reciprocal relationship and stewardship to the land. I don't know if that was succinctly said or not.
Yeah, and that's interesting, because when you're saying that, I was thinking about, we're really in the midst of huge upheaval right now with what's happening with court, especially in BC, what's happening with court cases and Cowichan tribe and even with DRIPA and, the potentially repealing or trying to walk that back.
Yeah.
And conceptually, it's funny, because people, their fear is like, well, we're going to get our land taken away. But that's not necessarily how Indigenous people think.
Yeah.
And it's not about we're trying to come in here and, remove you or displace you in any way. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding just within the general public of what that means and how we value things. Mm-hmm. I think that's a huge part of it.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, the Cowichan thing is, I was talking to my spouse about this last night, and I'm frustrated by particularly the online discourse around the Cowichan ruling. I think there's a bit of concerted effort to muddy the water when it comes to that particular conversation, for various reasons that I won't get super in depth into, because I could go on a whole paranoid rant about it. But I do think there is a fundamental misunderstanding around what that ruling is meant to do, and a cognitive dissonance fear that is not rooted in reality or truth. And again, I think it does come back to, obviously, that difference of worldview, where there's a Western understanding of land as private property and power, versus Indigenous people who see land as a fundamental part of the web of life, and that there's a reciprocal relationship that needs to be honored and respected. That said, the Cowichan ruling specifically is not about taking private property away from private ownership. Like, the Cowichan ruling is very much rooted in the very basic concept of the fact that the federal colonial government of Canada, especially in BC, created all of these agreements with First Nations and other Indigenous folks that were fundamentally not honored. So we have these agreements on paper, but then they were never actually followed through on. And the government of Canada, both federally and provincially, are aware of this. Like, This is not new information to any of them. And eventually, this was all going to come home to roost at some point, and the government was going to be forced to have to reconcile title and rights at some point. And that's ultimately what this is about, right? Like, it's about reconciling title and rights and government obligations that were never met. And unfortunately, because of the way that colonization and settlement played out, these lands that now are under dispute with regards to title and right are privately owned. But there are many ways to reconcile this issue that doesn't involve taking away private property from people. And in fact, that is what the Cowichan ruling is trying to do, is trying to set a precedent of how do we reconcile this disconnect between historic wrong with the contemporary understanding that reconciliation is what we need to be striving for now and into the future. And so I personally think the Cowichan ruling is a really interesting opportunity to think about what land back means in a practical sense, because I think within kind of like Indigenous spaces and discourse and activism and academia and all of these spaces, like the concept of land back is vitally important, and it's oftentimes left out of the conversation around reconciliation because it is so abstract. And because of how abstract it is, people then place their worldview and understanding onto that abstraction. And so for Western folks, that worldview is obviously tied up in property and power and commerce and all of those pieces. And so that's what they think of as land back, is, oh, we're going to have to give up our private property to Indigenous folks as reconciliation, when it's like, that's not what people are asking for. Like, land back can look like many different things. And again, me personally, I think the Cowichan ruling is a really interesting opportunity to figure out what that looks like in an actual tangible sense, instead of just this abstraction of a slogan like land back. I also do think it's kind of ironic that people are worried about their private property being taken away from them in the context of colonization, which creates a level of cognitive dissonance within folks, which I personally find very amusing to watch people kind of do that song and dance. But yeah, again, I'm Indigenous, so there's probably a bias here. In fact, I'm sure there's a bias here. But I do think the Cowichan ruling does offer up sort of the first opportunity to sit and think to ourselves, okay, what does land back mean in context of a colonial settled society that honors what was meant to be honored from the beginning without upsetting what is currently in place? Because obviously we don't want that, because then that just sets the whole concept of reconciliation backwards. So yeah, but again, like I said at the start, I think the online discourse, particularly around the Cowichan ruling, is absolutely being muddied in a way that is concerning.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yes.
It is, because I think it's instilling a lot of fear, and it doesn't have to be like that. Yeah. We don't have to approach it from that fear-based dynamic. And it could, but I mean, yeah, that's a whole nother conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think a big thing of it too, even you can't talk about land without resources. And I think, that's really what it's not just about private property, but it's about who controls these natural resources. Totally. And we're moving into, we need to be more aware and conscious of our environment. And, when you think of consumerism and all these different things, and, we almost need to reimagine natural resources as a whole. Oh, totally. And how, you think of here locally with the, forestry industry. Right now we're having 3 mills shut down. Yep. And it's like, okay, well, we've always been a predominantly resource-based community. How do we start to diversify? How do we look at, perhaps wood adjacent products or alternatives to wood? Or, that's a concept as well, that it's like, because I'm not super knowledgeable about that, but I do know that somebody needs to be looking at it.
Yeah, no, totally. And it's really interesting you bring up forestry in BC, because I'm a research assistant for another side project aside from my PhD that's talking about the future of forests, sort of focused right now in the northern part of BC. And I think this conversation is particularly evident within the forestry sector of BC right now for a variety of reasons, from economic all the way down to our climate and environment are changing, and our forestry practices I say our forestry practices. Let me back that up. Western colonial forestry practices that have been the dominant practice since colonization have made choices and decisions to prioritize particular things based off of the worldview that underlies them that has decreased the resilience of forest ecosystems broadly. Mm-hmm. And as our climate and everything changes, that decreasing and lack of resilience is now coming back to bite forestry in the butt a little bit.
Yeah.
And then obviously you have all of this economic stuff on the side as well that is then contributing to this in a different way. So you kind of have a whole bunch of sort of colliding factors right now that I think puts the forestry industry in BC in a really interesting place of how do we reimagine what this looks like moving forward? And I think as much as it is in a period of upheaval right now, you can't necessarily have growth and change without some discomfort. Mm-hmm. And I think particularly for forestry, like obviously other natural resources like mining and oil and gas are a totally different bag. But speaking specifically for forestry, I think right now the industry is very much in a period of extreme discomfort. And at least in the conversations that I have been having with other professionals in the forestry industry, there is very much an awareness that what has been done up to date is not working. And in fact has caused us to kind of regress in terms of what we are able to do on the landscape. And so there is this changing of mentality and a slow, which pace is a whole other conversation, but there is a change sort of in the understanding of the impact that Indigenous land stewardship has had. And it's, I'm going to go on a little bit of a digression. It's interesting. So part of my research is working with an Indigenous community and their forestry department and figuring out how to restore the landscape to be able to then bring back fire stewardship in a wide-scale safe way, because the area where my project is right now, the forests are very unwell, and doing wide-scale fire stewardship would just not be safe. So we need to try and get the landscape back into a cleaned-up space, which is what my research is looking at. Mm. But through my research process, I've been obviously doing a lot of reading, and one of the things that I keep coming back to, and again, obviously, this is knowledge that's already exists in Indigenous spaces, but I'm starting to see it kind of come up into Western spaces too, is this idea that when settlers first came over to Turtle Island, there's a lot of ethnographic, that's the word. There's a lot of ethnographic research from these sort of first settlers talking about how managed the landscape looked. And there's a particular book that I've been reading that's specifically talking about California, but the whole Pacific this applies to the whole Pacific Northwest. But they were talking about how essentially manicured and curated almost the landscape looked like, and they equated it to parks over in Europe, and because of
That's
race.
Very interesting.
Yeah, and because of racism and all of those pieces, there was also this cognitive dissonance of acknowledging that clearly the landscape was being interacted with in some way, because it was very clear that it wasn't just unruly, untouched. But at the same time, even though they were acknowledging this, they were also stating that Indigenous people were hunter-gatherers and just sort of like transient across the landscape and moving as like resources shifted and changed, but didn't actually participate in stewarding the land. And so then obviously they kind of used that justification for taking land away from Indigenous people. But in actuality, the First Nations folks of the Pacific Northwest have managed landscapes for time immemorial, through the application of fire, through clam gardens in along the coast. Like they're so up in Wet'suwet'en territory. There's evidence of forest gardens, and you see I can't remember which species specifically you see together, but there's a distinct set of 3 species that you'll find out in the forest, and that's an indication that that was a forest garden. And so there's all of this evidence that shows that Indigenous people were actively managing the landscape, but they weren't managing the landscape in your typical like fixed plot agricultural style of management. They were doing it at a landscape level to meet a wide variety of needs and to ensure that there was a healthy and sustainable system all across their territories. And so with that realization, I think Western people are starting to understand, like, look, restoration of natural resources or restoration of natural spaces doesn't need to be this hands-off process where we just pack up all of our gear and say, see ya, and let the land do what the land does. Like, it's not what Indigenous people are saying when it comes to land stewardship. What Indigenous people are saying is, no, human beings are an active part of this larger ecological web, and we have, as humans, the imperative and the need to be an active participant within the landscape and to steward the landscape. And so I think we need to move away from this like colonial dichotomy of either you're on the land and taking resources for commercial value, or you're restoring the land and you're just letting it do its thing. Like that's not what Indigenous people are saying. Indigenous people are saying there's a middle road there where we can utilize the landscape for resources, but we need to actively steward the landscape and balance what we take with what we give. And that is out of whack currently. And so before we can do that, we need to figure out a way to curb back on the extraction side of the equation and focus on getting that sort of reciprocal stewardship aspect back in alignment, so that once everything is back functioning and in a healthy, sustained way, then we can go, okay, how do we reevaluate what resource extraction looks like? And I don't know if any of that made sense, but I think forestry is in an interesting position to be kind of the first natural resource extractive industry that thinks about this in a creative way, and approaches how we do extractive commercial resource development in a more holistic and reciprocal sense, as opposed to just like extract, and then act all shocked when things suddenly aren't healthy any longer. I hope that made some level of sense.
It does. It actually makes a lot of sense. And I mean, here's the thing. Us as individuals that aren't involved within land or forestry or any natural resources, because I feel like we need to start taking accountability.
Yeah.
We need to start participating. And it's not that, the people that we put in charge, it's not that we can't trust them, but I think that there's an onus on us that we need to take. I mean, is that education? Is that like, how can we start working together in a way where we're going to start eliciting change?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So obviously, again, through my own research, I read a lot, and I typically try and focus on resources that are written by and for Indigenous people. And there is I don't know if she would call herself a restoration ecologist, because that's kind of colonial in language, but I'm going to use that for clarity. Jennifer Grenz, she is a restoration ecologist at UBC. She has a beautiful book, Medicine Wheel for the Planet. Highly recommend. But in that book, she kind of addresses that to a certain extent, this level of accountability. And one of the things that she talks about is it all starts from the way we talk about and relate to land. And that the way that we change. So like, for example, one of the things she talks about is this like concept in restoration ecology around this whole like Eden ecology, which goes back to this very colonial idea of like untouched wilderness, and that's the way that it should inherently be, and all of these pieces. But that brings into the question of like, well, whose baseline are we using for what this should look like? And so she really talks about like moving language away from this idea of untouched, untamed wilderness that human beings have just come in and made a whole muck of, and move more towards this concept of human beings as healers and stewards, as opposed to extractivists and managers, and be very mindful about the language that we use. And so another example is in a lot of Indigenous discourse around land is not referenced with a lowercase l. Land is referenced with an uppercase L, because land is in of itself her own whole being, and is a whole person made up of, in the same way that we're made up of trillions of individual cells and all of these little microorganisms and everything crawling all over us at any given time. Like, land has its own equivalent of that, right? Yeah. And so it's all about this shift and change in language and how we relate to land. And I think one of the things that I think a lot of people can start by doing, and is something that's just really easy, is go for a walk, go up to a tree and introduce yourself. And I know that sounds silly, and for people who are really not used to that, it can be like, well, why would I do that? But if there's a lot of like psychological research that shows that when you actively think about your cognitive process and make active decisions to change your thought process over time, that rewrites your neural pathways. And so, and I mean, that's true of like developing a sense of self-love too. Like, obviously one of the exercises that people tell you to do is look in a mirror and tell yourself you love yourself. And I mean, speaking from experience, that's super uncomfortable at first. Yeah, like, it's not a comfortable process, but that's because you're doing something that is completely different to the neural pathways that you are used to having. And so go out to a tree, introduce yourself, have a conversation with a tree. And if you do that on the regular, you start to see trees not just as these things that take up space, but you start to see them as a relational being that you are building a relationship to. Like, I think Western society has done a really harmful thing in numbing us to our natural surroundings. Yeah. And I've had this conversation with my spouse too, where it's one of those things where even just stepping outside and taking a second to just listen to what is happening around you, and not to the city noises, but to the birds, the wind, the creaking of tree, and like actually try and engage with those senses that have been, unfortunately, I think, taken out of many of us, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike. Like, it's because that's just a byproduct of the colonial worldview of the natural world as a possession and not an inherent being in and of itself. And I think once you build a relationship with something, the act of accountability becomes much easier, because you don't well, again, this is a generalization. Most people, when they're in a relationship with someone, they don't want to actively cause harm to that person.
Yeah.
Again, generalization.
Yeah.
And you want to do right by your loved ones and your friends and all of that. And so I think when you start to see non-human beings as loved ones, it makes being accountable to them much more front of mind. And I know it's weird. I tell people to go talk to trees and they give me a weird look, and I'm like, I don't know what to tell you, man. Like, you just go have a conversation, sit by a tree, sit by a river and listen to the river. Like, it's about listening and again, listening and building that relationship.
Yeah.
Because we don't listen as much as we should in our day-to-day lives.
Yeah. That's really powerful, actually. So, we're running out of time here.
I'm so sorry.
No.
I just ramble.
No. This is perfect. That's exactly what we're looking for. So, I mean, not necessarily based on what we said today, but just thoughts in general. What would you like our viewers to know?
I think that more and more people are realizing that things don't feel right. And I think for a lot of non-Indigenous folks, they don't understand why things don't feel right. And not just from like a system sense, but I think there's a fundamental part of many of us that are like, this doesn't feel right. Like there is a hole in me, in us, that is not readily understandable. And I do think that a big part of that hole is this fact that we have been ripped from an intimate relationship with the land through many, many, many factors. Like this is a very nuanced conversation. Yep. And I think for those people who are really struggling and just don't know how or why, I would really encourage those people to try and get out on the land as much as possible. And I recognize, like, if you're in an urban setting, that can be challenging. We're really lucky in Prince George because we're kind of right smack in the middle of a forest, and like there's lots of trees around. Like I live very close to the Hudson's Bay wetland area. Very easy to just go walk into the trees, and I encourage folks to do that. Like, go and reconnect with nature. Like, get your hands dirty, go listen to the birds, talk to the trees, like spend some time reconnecting with the land, because everything we have is from the land. Like, this table is made of wood. Our clothing is made of, I mean, most of it's plastic, let's be honest, but that plastic is made from oil, which is taken from the land, and oil is made from the decomposing carcasses of dinosaurs. Like, you know what I mean? Like, everything that we have and that we use in our day-to-day life is from the land in some capacity. And we need to rekindle that relationship piece and not just have this be sort of a land is this sort of like passive thing in our minds that we just don't actively think about. And from the people that I have spoken with and have had conversations, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, people who actively take the time to do this and reconnect with land and with non-human beings, there is a distinct change in how you feel within yourself. And that's not just me saying it. There's tons of research that shows this too. Like, I'm not just talking out my butt because I'm an Indigenous person who likes being on the land. Like, there is actual legitimate Western research that shows the benefits of learning outside, listening to bird song for your, like, I think that there's a paper that talks about how, like, intentionally listening to 10 minutes of bird song gives you the same psychological benefit as 10 minutes of mindful meditation. Like, there is research that fundamentally shows that our whole systems are set up to respond to and be in relationship with land. And the fact that we are not, I think, is a fundamental reason for why people feel so disconnected. And again, there's a lot of other nuances and factors that go into it, but I think that is definitely one of the reasons why humans feel so hollow, aside from, surviving late stage capitalism and all that good stuff. But yeah, and so yeah, I think the thing that I would want listeners to be aware of is that the land holds you. It holds all of us. And there's no barrier to entry for that. Like, you don't have to be Indigenous to be held by the land. Like, the land holds every single one of us. And in the same way that when we're sad and we feel sick and we want a caregiver, like, and if you don't have that in your life, the land can be that for you. So use that. Like, use that tool to ground yourself and help you move through this reality in all of its facets. But there is no barrier to the land holding and comforting you. And I think that in a world that is out of our control, that is something we can take control of, is returning to the land.
That is so beautiful. I think that is the perfect culmination, not just of this conversation, but the whole series and what we need to do to move forward. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.